ADX Florence vs Guantanamo, which is worse? For most prisons, the punishment ends at the cell door. For some places, the punishment is the door. There are two locations the U.S. government rarely talks about in the same sentence. One sits buried deep in the Colorado mountains, invisible by design. The other exists outside the mainland entirely, surrounded by ocean, politics, and silence. Both are meant for people considered too dangerous, too powerful, or too symbolic to exist anywhere else. But only one question matters. Which is worse? To answer that, we have to go inside both. The purpose of no escape. Every prison claims to hold the worst of the worst. Only two were designed specifically to erase influence, communication, and identity. ADX Florence was built to end something very specific: control. Not control by guards. Control by inmates. Before ADX existed, men ran entire criminal networks from behind bars. Orders went out. Killings happened. Guards were intimidated. Systems failed. The response was absolute isolation. Guantanamo Bay was different. It wasn't built to stop prison power, it was built to hold people the legal system didn't know what to do with. Not convicted criminals. Not prisoners of war. Something in between. And that distinction changes everything. But to understand how, we need to step inside the first place where time itself becomes a weapon. ADX Florence, the silent machine. ADX Florence does not look dramatic. That's intentional. No towers. No shouting. No visible chaos. Inside, everything is quiet. Too quiet. Each inmate lives alone in a concrete cell roughly the size of a parking space. The walls are poured concrete. The bed is concrete. The desk is concrete. Even the stool is concrete. There are no bars. Bars imply interaction. These doors are solid steel. Inmates spend 22 to 23 hours a day inside that cell. Every day. Meals arrive through a slot. Conversations are almost non-existent. Most human voices are heard only during orders, counts, or disciplinary warnings. Some inmates go weeks without hearing another prisoner speak. And this is not temporary. ADX is designed for years. Sometimes decades. The logic is simple: if you remove all stimulation, all influence, all contact, eventually the threat disappears. But something else appears instead. And what that does to the human mind becomes clear very quickly. A day without time. Time at ADX Florence doesn't move normally. There is no routine you can feel. No noise to mark hours passing. No faces to read. Lights turn on and off automatically. Meals arrive without warning. Recreation, if allowed, happens alone in a concrete pen with walls high enough to block the sky. Inmates call it the dog run. 1 hour. Sometimes less. No weights. No contact sports. No conversation. Just pacing. And thinking. Thinking becomes dangerous here. Former prisoners have described losing the ability to remember faces, including their own. Some reported hallucinations. Others began talking to walls, insects, or imaginary people. Not because they wanted to. Because the brain cannot survive emptiness. But this is where ADX draws its power. The suffering is invisible. No bruises. No screams. Just erosion. And the most unsettling part. This is all legal. Who ends up here? ADX Florence doesn't hold many inmates. Fewer than 400. But nearly every name carries weight. Terrorists. Cartel leaders. Serial killers. Men who killed guards. Men who ordered murders from prison. This is not about rehabilitation. ADX is about neutralization. If someone can influence others, they are removed from everyone. No gangs. No hierarchy. No reputation. Just a number behind a door. But this raises a question that quietly haunts the facility. If a prisoner can't harm anyone anymore, why keep punishing them this way? That question has followed ADX since the day it opened. And it becomes even more complicated when we compare it to a place that exists in a legal gray zone the world still argues about. Guantanamo, the prison without a sentence. Guantanamo Bay is not a prison in the traditional sense. It was never meant to be. It was designed as a holding facility after September 11, built for speed, not permanence. The assumption was simple: detainees would be questioned, classified, and released or transferred. That was over 2 decades ago. Many of the men held there have never been charged with a crime. Some have never seen a courtroom. Others were cleared for release years ago and are still there. Guantanamo doesn't operate on sentences. It operates on uncertainty. And uncertainty, over time, becomes its own form of punishment. Life inside camp blocks. At its peak, Guantanamo held hundreds of detainees across multiple camps. Conditions varied wildly depending on the year, the camp, and the political climate. Some detainees lived in communal blocks with limited interaction. Others were held in isolation units resembling supermax conditions. Unlike ADX, Guantanamo changed constantly. Rules shifted. Privileges appeared and disappeared. Interrogation methods evolved. What remained consistent was the absence of an end date. No release schedule. No sentence length. No countdown. For many detainees, the most crushing question wasn't how long. It was why. And that uncertainty altered everything about survival inside the camp. Control versus confusion. ADX Florence is brutally consistent. Guantanamo is unpredictably inconsistent. At ADX, inmates know exactly what tomorrow looks like. At Guantanamo, tomorrow depends on politics, intelligence reports, and decisions made thousands of miles away. That difference matters. At ADX, the punishment is isolation. At Guantanamo, the punishment is limbo. And the human mind reacts differently to each. Some prisoners at ADX break quietly. Some detainees at Guantanamo resist loudly. Hunger strikes. Protests. Legal battles that stretch for years. One place strips identity through silence. The other suspends identity altogether. But neither is finished with the person inside. Not yet. Because the deeper damage happens later. Survival rules they never write down. Every prison has rules beyond the rulebook. At ADX, the unspoken rule is simple: do not react. Emotion draws attention. Attention invites restriction. Inmates learn to suppress anger, fear, even hope. At Guantanamo, survival often means compliance, but not submission. Detainees learn when to speak, when to stay silent, and when resistance is the only control left. Both places force men to adapt in unnatural ways. And when they leave, if they leave, those adaptations don't disappear. Which leads to the most disturbing question of all. If one place destroys the mind slowly, and the other traps it indefinitely, which is worse? The answer doesn't come yet. Because we haven't reached the part where these systems fail. And when they fail, the consequences are permanent. When the mind starts to turn. There is a point in extreme confinement when discipline stops working. At ADX Florence, that point usually comes quietly. Former inmates have described a moment when thoughts no longer follow a straight line. Memories arrive out of order. Sounds feel closer than they are. Silence becomes loud. Some begin to hear voices, not voices telling them to act, but voices narrating their own existence. Others lose the ability to speak fluidly after years without conversation. This is not panic. This is deterioration. Medical staff at ADX have acknowledged that long-term isolation can cause lasting psychological harm. Court records reveal inmates who entered mentally stable and left with diagnoses they never had before. And yet, the system rarely changes. Because ADX was never designed to heal. It was designed to hold. But Guantanamo breaks people in a different way. And it doesn't wait as long. Interrogation as an environment. In its early years, Guantanamo blurred the line between detention and interrogation. Sleep schedules were disrupted. Cells were relocated without warning. Temperatures were manipulated. Not always violently. Not always physically. But consistently. For detainees, the environment itself became the interrogator. Unlike ADX, where routine never changes, Guantanamo thrived on unpredictability. One day brought books and conversation. The next brought isolation. The message was clear even when words were not. Nothing here is permanent. Including your sense of reality. And when that instability stretches into years, it reshapes a person's understanding of time itself. The problem with forever. ADX Florence sentences are long, but they are defined. Life without parole still has structure. Appeals exist. Timelines exist. Guantanamo offers none of that certainty. Some detainees have been held for over 20 years without trial. Cleared for release, yet still confined due to diplomatic or political obstacles. Imagine waking every day knowing you are legally approved to leave, yet still locked in place. That paradox destroys motivation. At ADX, inmates count years. At Guantanamo, detainees stop counting entirely. And when counting stops, something else fades with it. Hope. Power structures without power. Traditional prisons develop hierarchies. Gang leaders. Shot callers. Enforcers. ADX Florence was designed to eliminate that completely. No interaction means no structure. Inmates cannot build alliances. They cannot recruit. They cannot intimidate. But power doesn't disappear, it internalizes. Control becomes personal. Who can endure silence longer? Who can suppress emotion more completely? At Guantanamo, power operates differently. Guards rotate frequently. Policies change. Authority feels distant and abstract. Some detainees attempt influence through hunger strikes, legal filings, or media attention. Others withdraw completely. In both places, power exists, but it never belongs to the person inside. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Extreme confinement doesn't just affect thoughts. It alters sleep cycles. Appetite. Muscle tone. At ADX, limited movement leads to physical atrophy. Some inmates pace for hours just to feel motion. At Guantanamo, stress manifests in ulcers, chronic pain, and long-term cardiovascular issues. Doctors have testified that the body begins to treat confinement as a permanent emergency. Adrenaline never fully shuts off. And when release finally comes, if it comes, the body doesn't know how to stand down. Release does not mean freedom. Leaving ADX Florence is rare, but it happens. Leaving Guantanamo happens more often now, but not without consequence. Former ADX inmates have described panic attacks triggered by crowds, silence broken by sudden noise, and an inability to make simple decisions. Former Guantanamo detainees often face surveillance, travel restrictions, and social isolation in their home countries. Neither group returns to normal life. Because normal life requires trust. And both places train people to expect harm from unpredictability, or from stillness. The systems defend themselves. Both institutions are frequently criticized. Both are frequently defended. Supporters of ADX argue that extreme isolation is the only way to prevent dangerous individuals from harming others. Supporters of Guantanamo argue that unconventional threats require unconventional detention. The question becomes less about cruelty, and more about necessity. But necessity has a habit of expanding. And once a system proves it can operate without transparency, it rarely contracts on its own. Which one leaves the deeper scar? ADX Florence strips a person down until only endurance remains. Guantanamo suspends a person until identity erodes. One is surgically precise. The other is legally unresolved. One destroys through repetition. The other through uncertainty. And the worst part? Both can claim success. Because success was never defined as recovery. Only containment. So which is worse? The place that guarantees silence for decades? Or the place that never guarantees an ending at all? Perhaps the answer isn't found in architecture or policy. Perhaps it lies in what each place reveals about punishment itself. When fear replaces justice. When isolation replaces accountability. When silence replaces resolution. The prison no longer holds the person. The idea does. And once that idea exists, it never stays contained. When punishment outlives its purpose. At some point, punishment stops being about safety. It becomes about precedent. ADX Florence and Guantanamo Bay were both created in moments of fear, fear of losing control, fear of unseen threats, fear of what happens when the system fails. They were not built casually. They were built urgently. And urgency has consequences. ADX perfected isolation. Guantanamo normalized detention without resolution. Neither was meant to be ordinary. Both became permanent. The danger isn't just what happens inside these places. It's what they teach us to accept. The men who never left, even after they left. Some men eventually walk out of ADX Florence. Some eventually leave Guantanamo Bay. But very few ever truly return. Former ADX prisoners have described needing years to relearn how to speak without rehearsing every sentence in their head. How to tolerate noise. How to sit across from another human without scanning for threat. Former Guantanamo detainees have spoken about the impossibility of rebuilding identity when the world knows you only as a suspicion. In both cases, the punishment followed them. Not as trauma alone, but as conditioning. Their minds adapted perfectly to places they were never meant to survive. An adaptation, in this context, is not a victory. The silent failure no one counts. Governments measure success in incidents prevented, not lives damaged. ADX can claim no major escapes, no organized violence, no communication with the outside world. Guantanamo can claim intelligence gathered, threats neutralized, wars disrupted. But what isn't measured is the cost of indefinite erosion. What happens when a system proves it can operate without an endpoint? What happens when fear becomes justification instead of exception? Because once the line moves, it never moves back easily. The real comparison. ADX Florence is worse if you believe the mind requires connection to remain human. Guantanamo Bay is worse if you believe justice requires resolution. One crushes through certainty. The other through ambiguity. One tells you exactly how your life will end. The other never tells you anything at all. And maybe that's the truth hiding beneath the comparison. The worst prison is not defined by walls, or location, or security level. It's defined by how long it takes something essential to disappear. What this says about U.S. These places exist because society demanded protection. But they continue because society stopped looking. As long as the people inside are labeled monsters, enemies, or threats, the methods don't have to be questioned. Silence becomes convenient. Distance becomes comfort. And the debate fades. Until the system expands again. The question that remains. So which is worse? ADX Florence. Or Guantanamo Bay. Maybe the more dangerous answer is neither. Because the real question isn't where these places are. It's how easily we accepted them. And whether, one day, the definition of who belongs there changes. These institutions were built to hold the uncontainable. But in doing so, they revealed something uncomfortable about punishment, power, and fear. And once you see that, you can't unsee it.